Surely this was a mistake. Perhaps the city AI was malfunctioning. Maybe a solar flare messing with the electronics. In either case, he couldn't just spin on his heels and leave the city. Who'd help his mum? The city erupted into movement. Luke, now driven by adrenaline, began fast walking, then jogging, then running towards home. The frantic movements of the people of the city erupted into chaos as people began getting their wits about them and start running to evacuate. People grabbing what they can carry and following the city's guidance to the evac stations. Cars began speeding and ignoring traffic signs to get out faster. What was happening? Was there a major incident? Maybe the city AI was going rampant. Maybe there was an impending natural disaster or the city's power station was about to go critical. Maybe the insurrectionists were staging a hostile takeover. Or maybe the Covenant had finally arrived. Whatever was happening, the superintendent wasn't being forthcoming about it beyond telling people to head for evac. Thinking of all the possible reasons for this wasn't helping pass the time or distance to home, so instead he started formulating an impromptu plan to get him and his mum out of the city safely. Get home, tell mum what's happening, grab mum's medication, grab a couple of days of clothes, ID, my credit chip is in my back pocket, maybe grab some food out of the cupboards, and a few bottles of water, shove it all in a backpack, get mum's chair set up outside, get her in it, she can hold the bag, then we move to the evac station. Home, tell mum, medication, clothes, ID, credit chip, food, water, backpack, chair, mum, evac. He kept repeating it in his head as he ran city block after city block, dodging crowds of people, errant cars, and the general vitriol of chaos that had erupted. Luke stopped briefly at a street corner to catch his breath, and took a moment to take in what he was seeing. People were running in seemingly every direction. Many, like him, were probably running to get loved ones and essentials from home. Some were looting, kicking through shop windows and stuffing all in sundry of goods into their coats before fleeing. Others just aimlessly wandering trying to find lost loved ones in the crowds. Some unfortunate souls had fallen in the chaos and had been trampled to death by the crowds. Luke refocused, took a few deep breaths and ready to run again. Just as he was about to take off, a huge flash strobed through the city, bathing everything in harsh white light, and casting long, deep shadows. A wave of heat smashed into the side of his face, and Luke blinked rapidly to clear his vision, and turned to the source of light. A large explosion outside of the city blossomed into the sky. Moments later, a wall of condensation and dust rushed up the avenues of the city, and Luke was thrown back several feet by the shockwave of the explosion. A sudden crash, followed by a deep, long rumble, deafened him. All he could hear was the muffled sounds of panic and a high-pitched whistling. The explosion must have been one of the city's reactors. Maybe it wasn't the Covenant after all. Maybe now it's actually blown, the emergency services can respond to it, and we won't have to evacuate. Everything went black. Luke awoke coughing. Dust had settled onto his face, and his eyes stang and watered. His hearing had partially returned, and he cleared what grime he could from his face with his sleeve. He looked around to find the streets now mostly empty. They were littered with abandoned cars, debris, clothes, looted goods, litter, broken glass, and chunks of polycrete. His head throbbed. He reached a hand to the top of his head to find his hair was matted with congealed blood and dust. A still tender laceration on his scalp, and a notable welt on his head suggested to an object hitting him over the head and knocking him unconscious. As he looked around himself, he noticed a chunk of polycrete the size of his head resting on the floor 3 feet from where he woke up. This may have been the perpetrator of his head wound. He checked his wristwatch, but it was broken. He was unsure how long he'd been unconscious, but he knew he had been. Then, like a wave, he remembered. Home, tell mum, medication, ID, credit chip, clothes, food, water, chair, mum, evac. Luke rolled quickly to his feet. Something hurt in his chest, but he ignored it and got his bearings once more before setting off again in a stagger towards home. After a block or two, he came across several vehicles that had been involved in a pile-up, including a bus, likely as a consequence of erratic driving, trying to flee the city. The vehicle's twisted mass of metal, plastic, and glass made for an impassable obstacle on the path ahead. He backtracked half a block to an alleyway and quickly made his way down its length, splitting off to a conjoining alley that would hopefully lead him back to the streets. the other side of the pileup. He neared the end of the alley and rounded the corner back onto the avenue. With a quick jog across the street to the other side, he reached an intersection that, to his right, showed the other side of the multi-vehicle pileup. He nodded to himself and rounded the intersection to continue on his route home when he was suddenly frozen to the spot by the sight that greeted him. A wide, purple, tuning fork-looking craft hovered above the ground, and a large group of Covenant troops hopped out of folding doors on the sides of the forks. There were avian-looking creatures with large circular energy shields, jackals as they'd been named by humanity, a dozen grunts, shorter, stockier aliens carrying large tanks on their backs, and a few tall, ornately armoured aliens with long necks and digitigrade legs, elites. They all carried chrome weapons pulsing with plasma energy. One of the elites spotted him and barked something to the others. All of the aliens' attentions now turned to Luke's presence. He willed himself to turn and run, but fear had collected in his chest, pooled in his legs and set to concrete. He waited for the inevitable volley of plasma fire that would surely be the end of him, when a crescendo of explosive booms echoed from above. The aliens tore their attentions from Luke to the source of the sound. Luke craned his neck to see as several matte black pods, still dimly glowing on their bottom surfaces, smashed into the asphalt of the intersection. No sooner had they impacted had the doors of the pods exploded off, and a team of ODSTs dived into action, firing their weapons into the horde of aliens before they really had time to react. The fork-shaped craft lifted higher into the air, its own tail-mounted plasma weapon turning to the new arrivals. Before a retaliatory strike could come, another group of drop pods smashed into the upper surface of the ship, crippling it and forcing it back to the ground from the force of the impact. The pods deployed, and the ODSTs within emerged from the wreckage to attack the aliens from behind as well. Luke's fight and flight instinct finally responded, and he began running towards cover behind a large dumpster. The ODSTs at the intersection moved in a tight formation up the avenue, taking out targets as they went. A sticky, glowing orb of cyan light slapped onto the ground near Luke. One of the ODSTs shouted,
"Move! Get out of there!"
Luke got up and ran in no particular direction. The orb detonated and threw him to the ground. He lay there for a moment, mentally checking his body for any broken bones or visceral injuries, but was interrupted by a firm hand grabbing the back of his shirt and pulling him to his feet.
"You good?"
the ODST asked from behind his mirrored visor. The ODST had red markings on his armor, which Luke recalled meant he was in charge. He had evidently been quiet for too long, obviously distracted by his armor, as the ODST dropped his head to meet Luke's gaze and asked again,
"Are you okay?"
Luke nodded and shook his head at the same time, but the ODST didn't seem to notice as he directed his team.
"Jay, got a couple of grunts in cover on the left. Hamish, Kyra, we got civilians holed up in that building. Bust the door in and get them out there and head in for evac. Mitch, get over here."
They followed the orders, and another ODST with a medic's patch jogged over.
"Check him,"
he ordered, letting go of Luke's collar. The medic quickly checked the top of his head, checked his eyes and a few scuffs and cuts Luke had obtained from sources unknown.
"He's okay, mostly superficial."
The medic, Mitch, Luke recalled, turned back to him.
"You'll need some stitches on your head when you get the chance, but it's okay for now."
He slapped him on the shoulder and returned to covering the other ODSTs. A group of civilians had been brought onto the street and were being guided to follow signs for evac. Luke turned his attention back to the ODST in front of him as he gripped the cloth of his sleeve near the shoulder. The name Markos was stenciled into the top of his chest plate.
"We gotta get you to evac."
Luke shook his head.
I can't. My mom, she's back at home. She needs my help to get around.
Markos looked around himself, scanning the area for threats.
"Okay, where is she?"
Luke tried to get his bearings.
That way. Down there, maybe 3 blocks.
Markos keyed his helmet comms.
"Hey, Van Collar, what's it looking like on grid Oscar 37?
A muffled response that Luke couldn't hear replied.
"Okay."
Markos removed his helmet and then fixed Luke with a strong stare that he knew instinctively that he could trust.
"That area is clear at the moment. Our platoon has just swept through, so you should be clear for now. I can't promise it's going to stay that way. Get in, get her, and then get out of here. Covenant are all over this sea, and successful evacs are rapidly becoming less likely. Get going.
Markos gave Luke a nod and replaced his helmet. Luke took the ODST's advice and began running. He looked back and saw the ODSTs pulling together again and moving off down one of the streets. Markos gave Luke another nod from a distance and followed his team. For UNSC, Luke thought to himself. They seemed like decent men, and he hoped that they, at least, managed to make it out of here alive. Though, he doubted it. After a few more blocks of running, Luke arrived at the street across from his apartment building. The outside was a little damaged from debris, and there were a few broken windows, but from what he could see, the place was intact, so Mum was likely just inside, waiting for him. He was about to cross the street to get inside when a streak of smoke and fire lanced from the top of his apartment building and smashed into the side of an oddly organic-looking ship as it passed above. The explosion damaged the hull of the vessel as it banked hard and came to an eerily stable hover. 3 large plasma weapons deployed from its underside and tracked around to the top of the building before firing bolts of orange-red plasma that began melting the polycrete and metal structure of the building. Luke watched on in concern, hoping the building didn't melt entirely as the alien vessel strayed to above the street. He kept low and watched the ship come to an eerily stable hover again, its large plasma weapons on its underside scanning the area for hostiles to fire upon. A bright light suddenly emerged from its undercarriage and 2 large creatures appeared from an aperture in its belly. The 2 behemoth creatures hit the floor with a notable thump, their cobalt armor plate shifting over orange, rippling flesh, spines several feet long on their backs splaying and relaxing as they stood up from the impact. The ship held position for a moment, pivoted, and sped away, leaving the huge creatures behind. They turned and walked a little further from the apartment building towards Luke's location. He stayed still and low and watched. The creatures carried a huge shield on one arm and a massive green glowing cannon on the other. One of the creatures had a deep, long gouge out of its shield. They came to a stop 20 feet away and turned back towards the apartment building, as if sensing something. Luke looked back to the building to try to determine what, and then saw movement inside one of the neighbours' apartments. There was a muzzle flash, met with the sound of shattering glass, and one of the creatures took a staggering step backwards, turning slightly from whatever impacted it. An obvious dent from a large caliber weapon now adorned the creature's chestplate, bright silver at the centre with scratches and sooting surrounding it. The creatures bellowed in response as a second round sang out across the street. The creatures turtled in their armour, lifting their shields into defensive positions and presenting smaller targets, and concealing their orange flesh from the attack, save for the exposed lower backs that Luke could see from his position behind them. The creatures lifted their massive assault cannons, which charged rapidly, and then fired streams of plasma at the apartment building, causing the front to melt, glass to shatter, and metal superstructure to warp. In almost slow motion, the building buckled at its midline and dropped 4 meters. The sides of the building folded inward like an origami figure, and in the following seconds, he watched the windows of what was his and his mother's apartment disappear into the fragmenting middle section and billowing dust of the building as it gave way under its own weight. The massive creatures stopped firing their cannons as the building settled and came to a rest, half the height it once was and leaning precariously over the street. Luke couldn't control the grief-strangled sound that left his lips a moment later, which prompted the massive creatures to turn to the source of the sound. They fixed him with steady glares from glowing green eyes. They took a single step in his direction and his legs took over. Before he was even fully aware, he was running down the street and darting into a wide alleyway between buildings. He ran on legs he could barely feel, around a corner, down a tighter alley, left and then right before finding a dark corner, hidden in the shadow, next to an inoperable air conditioning unit. He slid his back down the wall and slumped to the ground before hanging his head and crying. He couldn't think clearly. He just kept picturing his mum, alone in the apartment, waiting for him to come home, and the next minute the building collapsing in on her from all sides. A A few hours ago, he was leaving work, thinking about the things he needed to do when he got home and getting irritated by the mundane aspects of existence, and now, everything he knew was changing. His home was gone. The only person who gave a damn about him, the person who brought him into the world and raised him, was gone. And he couldn't even be there to hold her hand while she died. She died alone, scared, consumed by the very building that she called home. And in all this chaos, he craved to go back to this morning, when he was getting dressed and walking to work, grabbing his morning coffee and complaining about bills and the weather to the guy behind the counter. The tears fell heavy from his cheeks, but was interrupted by a sound in the alley with him. Luke wiped his tears free, blinked his vision clear again, and wiped his nose on his sleeve, and then listened. There was something moving further down the alley. Perhaps there were other survivors hiding here too, but he couldn't see through the darkness. Further down, the darkness was being broken by an eerie green glow. Those creatures must have followed him. Could they smell him? Hear him crying in the darkness? Could they taste him on the air, or sense his heat? He had no way of knowing, but they were most definitely here. He swallowed the lump in his throat, locked it away, and continued to watch and listen. The green glow grew brighter and began penetrating the darker corners, revealing a group of civilians huddled together, 6 or 7 of them trembling with fear. The hulking aliens stepped into view in the alley. One let out a noise that Luke felt in his chest more than he heard. The other's arm-mounted cannon glowed brighter, before firing a single bolt at nearly point-blank range that, for an instant, outlined the huddled survivors in a bright flash. Luke slid deeper into the corner, hoping the creatures didn't notice him. The shadow was suddenly broken by a strobing red light. Luke looked to its source, an emergency light on the wall that drew his attention to another, and then to a flickering light above a door, the only lit locations in this alley. He knew if he stayed where he was, with the lights on now, the creatures would definitely find him, so he had to get away from them. Staying low, he quietly moved across the alley to the door, quietly opened it, looking back down the alley to see the 2 creatures with their spike-punctuated backs turned to him. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The instant the door closed, the lights in the alley snapped off, dropping it back into darkness at the instant the 2 creatures turned to look. They stood a moment, before ambling off in the opposite direction. Inside, Luke found himself in a dark so deep he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. Emergency lighting flickered on inside, a small, glowing red line on the floor that traced a path through the darkness. He followed it carefully through the darkness, picking his way over debris, garbage, chairs, and other people's worldly goods that now littered the hallway. The light led him to a lobby where a single television screen flickered to life. The emergency broadcast message had appeared on the screen before the image flickered off, replacing it with the visage of an ancient Greek figure, dressed in a robe that hung loosely over one shoulder, leaving half of a well-muscled chest and one arm bare, holding a bident spear. The ghostly image had noble, angular features with long locks of hair and a full beard. The robe was secured over the shoulder with a gilded brooch, and the figure wore modest sandals.
Mr. Hunt, I am the Superintendent Class AI of the city of New Pylos. The Covenant have invaded the planet. We need to get you to your evacuation station immediately.
My mother, she...
I'm sorry about that. I can confirm she did not suffer.
What? How did you... How do you know that? You can't know that!
I'm not entirely certain you want to hear the details, but the structural collapse of the building caused a shear stress in a primary support column. With stresses that high, materials tend to yield in devastating ways. She wouldn't have suffered.
Luke was stunned into silence. A million thoughts raced through his head. Countless graphic images of what may or may not have happened to his mum. He felt like he wanted to know the specifics, but also knew that it wouldn't help the grief that was quickly overwhelming his senses. This rapidly gave way to a growing ache in his chest, and a lump returning to his throat.
Please, I understand what you're going through, but we must get you to your evacuation station. People need your help.
How could you understand? You're an AI. You don't have feelings. You're not human.
I may not have feelings, but I can comprehend the emotional toll such feelings of loss, grief, and shock can have on the human psyche. And I may not be human, but neither are the Covenant, and I do not see them trying to help you escape this city.
Luke was taken aback by the stern, unfiltered harshness of the reply. It seemed almost angry, which made him regret the tone he had taken with them. But it's an AI. AIs don't have feelings. Do they?
You picked a hell of a time to give a shit. For years, people have been struggling. I have been struggling to survive, to live by our means, and only now, that the Covenant arrive, do you suddenly develop compassion for humans?
My purpose is the stewardship of this city and its residents.
It's not your purpose, it's your job. And you've treated it like one all these years. Now, only now, that your own life is at risk, do you reach out to help? What's in it for you? You stay silent for decades, watching, scrutinizing, chastising, fining, and policing us, pressing us until all that most of us want is to escape. But the system is rigged to keep us stuck here, and now your little castle is breached. You offer me a way out. To what? For what? A planet that's being blasted? Or do you just want to ensure as many of us get off world so we can settle another city on another colony and get imprisoned by the same system all over again?
You are angry. This is normal given the circumstances. But I am not your enemy. I am not your captor. My primary directive in times such as these is to preserve human life to the best of my ability. But in this, I cannot and will not be wholly successful. However, you possess the means to provide help, and people need your help.
People need my help. What do you mean, people need my help?
A great many more people will die in this city if you do not get to your evacuation station.
People will die no matter where I am. How does me leaving change anything?
There is no time to explain. You must help, or you and countless others will die here. If you would rather that, please let me know so I may inform them.
Inform them? Are you threatening me? You trying to guilt trip me?
Absolutely not. Simply articulating the facts.
Luke stood in silence for a few moments in utter disbelief of the gall of this AI.
My mother!
Lucy P. Hunt, born March 25th, 2469, to Howard and Ann Hunt, raised in New Pahala, graduated New Pahala College in 2487, trained as a medical nurse, served 13 years at New Pylos General before having a single child, Luke, at 31, transferred to Lesso Medical Center to be closer to son's schooling, served 22 years, rising to chief nursing officer before falling ill with a genetic neurodegenerative condition, treatments mildly successful at abating disease progression and maintaining comfortable, if limited, quality of life. Son, Luke Hunt, moved in to assist in caring and financial needs. Lucy frequently confided in friends and former colleagues on her concerns at the burden the son had placed on himself, wanted more for him to succeed, to leave, to do better than her condition would allow, but ultimately grateful her son was so caring and dedicated to her.
Luke couldn't hold it together and broke down into remorseful tears. The AI remained silent for a while before continuing.
As a Superintendent Class AI, I have access to a wealth of data points that allow me to extrapolate events to high fidelity. I also, where possible, have means to exact influence. I take a great interest in the lives of my city's inhabitants. One of the more impressive was Lucy, your mother. She worked so very hard and did so much to ensure a good life for herself and her child. She gave decades of her life to the health and care of others, and when she fell ill, the system failed her when she needed it the most. I'm afraid even those systems I do not have the reach to influence, but where possible, I aided.
Luke's tears subsided and was replaced by a feeling of hollowness.
As I have said, in times such as these, my primary directive is to preserve human life. I cannot do this efficiently without your help. I understand this is a lot to hear, but she wanted better for you. She lived her life, hoping you'd succeed. I believe I have the means to begin you on that path, but you must be willing to aid, as she once was.
Why?
Luke asked. It took a while for the AI to respond.
My programming harbors an intrinsic connection to the denizens of my domain. For most, this is a very general protocol, but for reasons I cannot currently explain, she encompasses a connection much more specific in its form and identity, and by extension, so do you.
Luke picked himself back up off of the floor and pulled himself together. He nodded to himself silently as he pored over his thoughts. There'd be more questions for this AI in the coming hours, assuming he lived long enough to ask them. But for now, if nothing more than to honor his mother's passing, he finally spoke.
Okay. Where are we going?
Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, consider hitting the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss out on future content, and hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. It really does help the channel out significantly. Feel free to pop a comment below on anything you'd like me to cover next, and before signing off I just want to give a shout to my Patreon supporters, Spartan10148, my singular contender class ancilla, Falcon, Jordan and Poseidon, the metarchs of my facility, Sylphia, Ashley, Esoteric, Spartan 1029 and Chris Allen, my dutiful monitors, Darian, Legion, Labrat, Spartan 137, Chris, Element 0, J3, Mr. Keys, Gunslinger Cult, Evermore's Personal Devil, Scion Esports, and Saber, my diligent sub-monitors, my dominating fleet of Strato Sentinels, and my loyal enforcers, and all other patrons who continue to support the channel. I can't thank you guys enough. Big props to my Tier 0 YouTube members, Spartan 137, Talia, Fenrir, Bornstella, and Jimbo, and all other YouTube members keeping the installation running on that glorious vacuum energy. And if you really love what I'm doing here, consider supporting the channel via the links in the description. Much love, take it easy, and find peace in the domain.